Welcome to What Kind of Asian Are You? A podcast featuring conversations about being Asian. We are going to highlight, amplify, and validate Asian voices through deep conversations with those in the diaspora making a difference and being their best selves. I'm your host, Kyle. Welcome back to another episode of What Kind of Asian Are You podcast. I am your host, Kyle, and today we have Betty on the show. And with Betty, we have her on Never Jaded podcast before, where I do it with my co host, Robin, where we talk to her about her creative journey, her online creative coaching, and all that fun stuff. So if you want a more in depth look into that, make sure to check that episode out. And today I'm going to talk to Betty more specifically about herself, her journey overall, and like her thoughts and perspective on the creative journey. So, hi Betty, how are you doing today?
Hi, Kyle. Thanks for having me on the podcast. I'm doing great.
Yeah, so it's very nice to be able to have you on because I had such a fun time talking to you on the other podcast about being creative, taking that step and figuring out what's the best approach and how to look at being a creative while looking over like not just the creative side but also like the career and the business side. You're a wealth of knowledge in that aspect, I feel. So it's nice to be able to talk to you more about those stuff and also more about your kind of life and your experience because you had a quite a bit of a journey to get to where you are, I feel, and I want to talk more specifically about that. So with all my guests, I want to start off with just talking about who you are, what you're about, what you do in terms of work, your passions, and most importantly, what kind of Asian are you?
So I am right now I'm a filmmaker, fundraising consultant, as well as a coach for creatives, as you mentioned. In terms of what kind of Asian I am, I identify as many of the guests that have come on your podcast as 1.5 generation. I My background, I'm from Guangzhou, China originally, and then when I immigrated to Canada when I was 13, I went to Vancouver with my family. Then eventually went to U of T, University of Toronto for university, and moved to Toronto. And since then, have lived in Toronto. So in terms of what kind of Asian I am, I always like to say I'm Asian Canadian. I identify as both Chinese and Canadian, and also have a lot of pride in my Cantonese background.
That's awesome, and it's nice to hear that. Oh, you came to Canada with your family when you were a teenager. Because I have interviewed a lot of guests where they were either born here or came here early. So for you, what was your experience like coming like relatively late? Because usually a lot of people, especially from the diaspora, uh, became aware of like being in the West at an early age, or they came for university. But for you, you're in the kind of the middle stage where you have already have some formative years in your motherland, and now you're in a new country. So what was that experience like? And can you share like any kind of highlights or things that really like sticks in your head during those times as you're kind of navigating the experience of being an immigrant in a new country at the age of 13?
Yeah, definitely. I find that like for all my formative years coming to Canada, I like to say often one sentence that described the experience is that I became more Asian or Chinese after I came to Canada. That's how I felt because I when I immigrated, before I immigrated, I just conducted myself in a culture that's relatively homogeneous. You don't kind of distinguish from one another what is the culture common factors that you resonate with. In my case, I grew up in a lot of like Cantonese culture influence, and watch Hong Kong movies when I grew up. But I don't find that especially extraordinary as I was in Guangzhou. So when I moved to Vancouver, and I should also say I immigrated to an area that was has high Asian density, Richmond, BC. On one hand, it was kind of like a perfect place to ease into another culture. On the other hand, when, even though like it was relatively Asian kind of like populated city, it's still another country altogether and other kind of culture. And going to school, school has very different philosophy behind the way of like educating students. So there was definitely that certain level of culture shock. At the same time, like I find that in the Canadian culture, because it celebrates diversity, everybody becomes more of themselves, or like I think we all meet each other here in being the representative of our culture. So in some way, I feel like my Asianness actually got heightened, or like in situations where I have to answer uh, traits about my hobby or my upbringing, or my ways of like conducting myself, I actually need to highlight the more kind of like Asian or Chinese or Cantonese what you have, like those aspects of myself. So I feel that I become keenly more aware about those qualities that are supposedly fluid and intersectional, at the same time does describe or make us who we are, if that makes sense. Yeah.
That's a really interesting experience and point that you made, because I would have not expected that, because I think for most part the normal kind of narrative or kind of stereotype is like you kind of fall into like trying to assimilate or like leading into whiteness or like just mainstream society when you immigrate, especially when you are like older, because you want to fit in.
Mhm.
Discounting like when you were if say you're born here, obviously you would like have a lot more like Western influence, so that you wouldn't lead in so much to like or being aware of like that Asianness. But for you, it's like yeah, it actually heightened more than when you were back in your motherland, which I would have expected. But very interesting point. So you mentioned like oh, your kind of Asianness kind of got heightened. Did it really benefit you in terms of helping you fit in, or like just easing you into kind of Canadian society, Canadian culture, or was it like becoming of like a conflict of interest of or identity struggle, if there's any?
I think both. I definitely struggle, like many of the guests have shared on this podcast, that like what is my new identity and what's my belonging. Because the flip side of the coin of like feeling I'm the Asian here, of going back home, is at when I was uh, like just came into Canada. I remember going back to Guangzhou quite often every year. I feel like a Canadian person there whenever I go back home. So there does create this like identity crisis of like when I'm here, I'm identified being there. When I'm there, I'm identified being someone from here. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is I do think after, if I were to after kind of feeling struggle or like that sense of not belong, which still comes up like uh, now here and there, I do think that in a way it does give me, or other people who have similar experience, an interesting way of being aware of myself, being aware of how culture is formed, and being aware of how identity is formed. So when I went to university, I studied cinema studies and Asia Pacific study, and which we talk a lot of the literature about how culture and how like identities are formed, especially by the influence that we get from media. And I during that time, I think it allows me, kind of my interesting experience allows me to look at those content and look at like art form, especially in my case, cinema, a different perspective than my peers who might have grown up here and just have kind of the North American or Eurocentric education. Like, I mean, I remember taking a class called American Popular Cinema, and we would watch films like Jaws, or like some of the early kind of like classic film that people here or grew up here identify as like their popular culture education, which in my case is a completely new world. So that, I think, I sort of eventually internalize or understand it as a benefit for me to have a different perspective at looking at some stuff. Yeah.
That's really cool, and it's nice to have that perspective for sure, especially now when it's all about having the other perspective, having like a more globalized worldview, and having the ability to not just understand, but able to kind of communicate those ideas in another perspective. And you kind of mentioned now, like your study was in cinema studies and Asian Pacific studies. So with that, the natural kind of assumption would be, oh, going into filmmaking and to the art and all that. So what was the influence or the 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 reason why you decided to go that path, without going to like so much of like, oh, because oh, being creative and all that stuff, 'cause I assume that's not the original intent.
Mhm. Well, the story is interesting actually. The when in high school, after I immigrated, I had never thought that I would go into the arts for university because I also embody that kind of like immigrant dream of like let's be real here. Let's find something that's like that the way I put it is like, let's find something that I actually would be responsible for my family. So there you already can see some of my belief of like being very like embodying that Asian immigrant kind of like value. And it happens to be that I actually also really love and good at math. So all the way through high school, I was very determined. For some reason, at the time, I thought if I'm good at math, I would probably can go into either math degree or business degree. Later in life, I learned that business and math are not necessarily like that transferable. But anyway, that was my original kind of direction for my career. Then what actually happened was I started like thinking that, oh, I should really try to, if I was to go for like a math school or business school, I should really try to go for the best of the best. So I started taking the SAT. The SAT inadvertently really helped me with humanities and the arts because I my English just like improved like so dramatically within of 2 years. And then that kind of opened up another kind of interest. I said, oh, I'm really into the humanities stuff once I mastered the language. That's one thing. The other thing is, as I was like kind of like chasing this like perceived dream of like going to business school, I started going to like some business school boot camp and just like completely did not fit in. Like I was miserable there. So like there were a couple of things that I did that like started like telling me sign by sign that like was like like probably not the best way to go. And then eventually like what ended up happened was I couldn't get into the schools in the states that offer full scholarship, and then for the schools that I did get into, they were public schools, like including the New York University. So I was like feeling really low, like and very defeated, and feeling very existential. And I was like, why am I like working so hard, fully embodying that like A+ student, and still go nowhere? So at that point, I kind of like took a like 180-degree turn and thought if like if working hard is not getting me anywhere, I might as well just follow my heart and do something that I've always liked, which is the art. So I stay in Canada. At the time, U of T offered me a spot at the Woman Business School, but I wrote to them and be like, listen, I actually want to go into humanities. And the first year in university, I had no idea what specific subject of humanity I would get into. I just took all the classes that I thought were interesting. And that became kind of like the most liberating year in my kind of exploration and intellectual um, stimulation. And and then out of all the classes I took, I had specific interest in cinema studies. And I also got drawn one way or the other to the Asian study program on campus, and that's how I narrowed down my interests.
That's really cool. It really speaks to like so many other Asian diaspora in terms of their pursuit of what works for them and what they want to do, especially on like having the expectation of like making sure they make their parents proud with all the stuff that they do with university and their career, because oh, the parents did so much to get the whole family immigrated to a new country, so now you want to do something else that doesn't really suit like the immigrant dream, then that takes a lot of uh courage and bravery that we'll get into more specific, like how it you know came upon for you and what you would tell others in terms of how to overcome that. But before we get to that, I was just wondering, so you did that degree, it's a humanities arts kind of cinema studies, but how did that translate or transfer over to where you get involved specifically into the filmmaking, to the like the kind of uh grants and all that kind of thing? Because our arts degree is still kind of far removed from like filmmaking, because it's not like necessarily you took filmmaking specific courses, if I'm not wrong. Sorry to interrupt the podcast, but if this is a podcast that is bigger, this would be the time where we would be selling an ad for either a pillow, a subscription box, or online therapy, but we're not there yet. However, if businesses want us to do an ad for them, we are more than happy to do so. Just reach out to us. In the meantime, this is our time to say that you, the listeners, mean a lot to us. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can do that by listening, commenting, liking, and subscribing to the podcast on all social media platforms, as well as giving us a rating and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. We are at What Kind of Asian Pod on Instagram, and just search What Kind of Asian Are You podcast for everything else. And if you have a dollar or two to spare, buy me a coffee. Links in show notes. Now back to the episode.
Yeah, great question. So, this degree that I took, they're actually designed to train film critics or film academics. Like all we do are writing essays about films and watching films. We do nothing about production. So by I love it, but by like the third year, I was like, like I there's an aspect in my personality that I recognize that I actually like action. I like seeing the impact of my work, and I don't necessarily identify as someone that's just okay with like providing commentary on other people's work. So I started kind of figuring out like ways on campus that I can get into some action, like some film production, and give it a try. Eventually, the organization that provided me a lot of help is the Real Asian Film Festival based in Toronto here. They had a program that trains like first time filmmaker that are Asian, and I make a short film through it, and I loved the experience, and just continue went on and try to find mentors here and there, and that will allow me to learn from doing essentially because I don't have like a film production school program background. That's how I got into filmmaking. Then to answer your question, how I got into fundraising, when I graduated, like a lot of Canadian filmmakers, like you don't initially, it's really hard to like start off immediately have a pay gig. Um, in retrospective, I could have done it another way. Like there's ways that you can like become a film crew and get utilized and like start a career that way. But in my mind at the time, uh, and also through the connections I built, I understood there was another way that can leverage my strength in both cinema studies and film production, which was working for a film festival. So in my third year summer, I actually interned for TIFF, the Toronto International Film Festival, for their program. At the time, they had this amazing program called a 100 Year of Chinese Cinema. So I spent a summer there and loved that experience as well because working in film festival allow you to participate in curatorial dialogues, which is like 100% my background or my academic background, and also to that point about becoming more Asian, being here, it really also when it's like Asian specific like context, it also leveraged my Asian literacy. So that's why when I graduated, I started working for the Real Asian Film Festival and also sometimes do contracts for TIFF. And one thing led to another. In film festival, one of the very needed component is funding. In fact, that's like what most nonprofit needed. And I think there's also a personality in me that I really like to jump into like how the things behind the scenes of how things are made. So I got very interested in like, okay, how do I actually secure funding for organization? That's one thing that to another. That's how I develop my fundraising expertise. So both for filmmaking and fundraising, I would say I learned from the job.
So, wow, that's quite a journey, and honestly, I would have expected that from like a film kind of critic, kind of critique kind of background or just degree, because not the moves you made to get to like filmmaking and fundraising seems like a large leap, because filmmaking and to a certain extent fundraising is quite on a more creative side, especially behind the scenes thing. So from like you writing about film, how it is still creative, but not in the creating your own kind of content for consumption for like mainstream. So you taking that leap, was it something that you thought like, oh, now I'm a creative, now I'm in the creative industry, or you felt like it was just something I am doing until I figure out what else I can do? Because realistically, filmmaking and fundraising isn't exactly like your kind of stable kind of thing that you were hoping at least initially to kind of do, no, for that immigrant dream kind of thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's like, I feel like when I was having existential crisis, that's like the exact question I asked myself. It's like, did I arrive at the spot that is the immigrant dream? Uh, but so to answer, to attempt to answer that question, I think the one thing that I find that in my personality that suits for me is I do like having some kind of surprises. I'm not very like keen on like, okay, like that's the thing that I'm gonna do, and that's going to be the thing that I do for for so like for the entirety of my career. I feel like more and more like people are like this, right? Or they admit that they are like this. They like having different kind of twist and turn, but at the same time, we also like stability, which is also my case. So in my mind, I was trying to, for me, I felt like I was solving a mathematical formula in my head. I was like, how can I still uh, embrace the creative side, like you said, the content, the things that give me joy, and at the same time still make it a viable career. And at the time, it seemed like this combo really could work, and it's proving that it will be working. The thing that I would say is that the it for any kind of formula it requires tweaking. So like for a little bit, like I did feel like, is this going to work? I also went for a good dosage of burnout, uh and not uncertainty, and it took me like as long as like it take now to get to the spot right now that I feel like right now is like there are different setup around this identity about fundraising and and filmmaking and coaching that can work. So, for instance, one thing I would say is that when I was fundraising in house, I didn't really feel like it was the thing that I was like called to do. Like, I don't actually like being working from an organization within an organization full time. But that took me a long time to figure out and coming to term and then figure out another way. So that's a long way to answer your question. Yeah.
So with all that being said, you then just jumped into like, oh, filmmaking and just fundraising as a career, producing content that way, and working different production like uh getting involved in the film industry in Canada and all that stuff. And to be honest, that wasn't what I was initially like became aware of you of. Is more of like your next steps. I don't want to say you're giving up on those things. We'll get back to that obviously because of the recent moves you have made. But for most part, I became aware of you because of the coaching side of things. So can we now talk about like how did you get into coaching? Why did you get into coaching? And just your kind of no idea of why it's needed in terms of doing this. for yourself, because it is kind of, it could be considered creative, but still it's more of a like a kind of business or entrepreneurial thing that I don't think is as creative as what you're normally used to.
Hmm. I mean, the short version of this question, the answer, short answer would be that like when I encounter coaching, it like my gut just said like, wow, this can really fit with my career. Go for it. And I always encourage people to trust their gut. So like to looking backward, if I try to dissect how I got that feeling of like why coaching, why did it feel so right? There are a couple of reasons. One is because in some way I do see that kind of parallel between coaching and storytelling. Whereas like storytelling through an art form is really creating a dialogue with audience. In coaching, what I get continuously fascinated by is creating dialogue with ourselves. And the coach is there to just facilitate that process. The second reason for that is coaching is so fascinating to me is that um, I at the time, like, so I started around like I think last year beginning of the year, that's why I started encounter coaching, had started thinking about like what is the thing that I would like to be known as my impact in the larger scheme of things that of the industries I'm in, which I'm in, like the nonprofit industry as well as the film industry. I can continuously, and as I mentioned before, I get bored quite easily. So like at the time, I was like really feeling that like my next career move, it could potentially be returning to a bigger organization and be a fundraiser and do film on the side. That's not very interesting to me. It could potentially be that I try to become a full time filmmaker. But I feel like that would be actually walking away with some of the interests and the expertise that I would really have built up in terms of like leadership development and organizational development. So I was confused, for lack of a better word. And then when I encountered coaching, which was actually through professional development for my job, I thought this could like kind of beautifully bring in or converge on my interests. And then what kind of heightened it, that emotional reason was that we all know that like last March there was that horrific shooting with the Asian woman in Atlanta, and at the time, like it brings up a lot of emotion for everybody in the Asian community, and for me, I've been thinking about like how like I was really angry because of like the incident, but also like I've been thinking about like how I can support the community or the people like myself who achieve things that in the larger rhetoric of like supremacy or like the context that we are in, sometimes we encounter a lot of barriers. Of obviously there are barriers about racism and explicit like violence, but I in my career, and I'm sure a lot of people would resonate, is that there's also internalized barriers. So we already talked about on this podcast about some of the things that I came to believe about the immigrant dream, about like ceilings I set for myself, things that I struggle with because of the my experience as immigrant. And there's a lot of mindset things that simply a lot of other people just don't need to experience, like if they you're not like an Asian person or immigrant. So then I thought coaching is a good way to support other creators and Asian creators to help them to realize the version that they want for themselves, and for me, my contribution to the community. So that's all in all, saying that coaching at the time felt like it hit multiple dimensions of things that I want for myself and things that I want to contribute to the world.
That's great. It allows you to get what you want and also provide value to those that you care for, which is your Asian community, your just creative community as a whole. And going more in depth about like coaching and the coaching that you do for your clients and those that look for that assistant, what would you say is the kind of the biggest kind of lessons that you kind of impart on them, regardless of whatever goals they have. Like, say, if there's one overlying lesson or theme that you want to make sure to hit at with every client, what would it be? Is it being like the most authentic you, or is it that just believe in your gut? What do you think your coaching compared to other coaching will teach people?
Mm. So I think the two things that I would say is the one number one is something that I always like kind of like bring back on my Instagram when I talk about my coaching, is truly understand and embrace who you are, and from there work with this, what I like to call, you already have all the colors in your palette to develop the creative career model that you desire. So for me, it's not about further inducing uh, your sense of anxiety of what you don't have, because I think there's a lot of like narrative out there that does that, like you don't have enough skills, or you just don't have the talent to cut it, or you don't have this and that to make this level of career. This is really the kind of rhetoric that I want to walk away from, also being mindful of like how that can induce harm on people. So the second piece that like fundamentally inform my coaching and it would like to support my clients um, to get to is understanding that creative career is not either you have to be kind of the most talented artist out there, or you just don't have it at all. So we often hear that kind of rhetoric or narrative of like you either give it all in an artistic or creative career, or you quit. And we oscillate in those two extremes. But even with myself, I think overcoming that, oh, actually, the model doesn't need to be so black and white, has took me a long time. And we waste so much time and energy trying to surrender to those model. And I see that again and again in my clients. And really, I'm there to support them to figure out a model that works for them. It might well be that eventually you still want to have a full-time job in a creative sector, or it might well be that you have a full-time job somewhere else and a creative hobby stays with a creative hobby. But at least then you know that that is the model that works for you. And then if you're looking for a career transition, I might be able to help you to figure out there's something in the middle that fits your soul and still makes you feel financially stable. So that's the two things I would say that fundamentally informs my way of coaching.
That's awesome, and I really like what you said about how, you don't have to go all in. You can do it however way you like. There's no one method to prove that you're creative. If you're creating something, you're therefore already is a creative. It doesn't matter how much effort or how much time you put into it, because we are always saying that art is subjective. So therefore, you can't really put a value on, how much effort you put in to art. If something takes like 1 second to do, and people think it's beautiful, it's still art. So you can't take away from that. And I was just wondering, as you were talking about, like, how you think you're giving great value by contributing through coaching. How come you haven't kind of go through this same thing with, like, maybe rather than teaching creatives, like, or coaching them in this way, why don't you consider doing it where you teach it more in terms of filmmaking and all that stuff, because that's also your expertise. Why do you lean into like this kind of creative coaching rather than say filmmaking? Because I think there's a lot of desire or interest in that from people, because filmmaking is still very popular.
I think that specific, like there are two ways I think about that questions. One is that like there is such a thing for me of like the work that has a fit for who to do it. So for filmmaking, even when you brought it up just now, in my head, it doesn't sound very exciting to me. I don't know why. I think that I'm just not very excited about like teaching people the like hands-on things of how to make a film. So at the end of the day, I still want to find intersection that things that I'm truly interested in. The second thing about teaching someone a skill is that I do think that there are other people out there that are doing that. Like, I mean, earlier I mentioned Real Asian has an excellent program doing that, and that's completely free. I think it's also about what space people occupy, especially in communities that are like the Asian communities, that we should all be allies to each other. We should all try to like do something that is like collectively would bring out the greater good. So I don't want to them take up the space that other people already taking up the space. For me, I really saw that, or I still think that there's a lack of like coaches specifically serve creatives, and then there's a lack of coaches in the Asian community. It's similar to like that. I feel like the Asian community still need to come around with like therapy. I see a similar rhetoric with like career coaching. I mean, I still struggle to explain this to my Asian family what I'm doing right now. So that for me is exciting, and it's exciting for me as a thing to do. So that's why I went for that direction.
Yeah, so you mentioned like, oh, it's still quite hard to have, Asian creative wrap around their heads of like, oh, coaching is something that they can consider doing. So what would you say would be, let's just say, on the perspective of being an Asian creative, like what do you think they need in order to have them get ready for coaching? Like, what do they have to go through before they be like, yes, this is what I need? Like, are there like some things that you normally see, like, oh, these people have this, this, and this, and now they're looking for assistant in coaching. That's why they're doing it. Is there like some signs of it, or it's really random?
I feel that you asked a simple question half a year ago when we did the other podcast, and now I have a better answer. And the answer really comes down to this. Are you ready? It's really short. That you have a desire to change. You would like to some degree of change, but you've tried things elsewhere that are like the common tips about skill development or common tips about developing your career, and they don't seem to work for you. That's when you're kind of in the spot that we're ready to chat.
That's yeah, I agree with that. And it really, yeah, it comes down to you want that change. And with coaching, I think it helps even more because it really more directly tailors to what you need, what's your objective, and compared to like all these kind of skill development where it's like, oh, this is particular skill I'm really good at, I can teach you how to do it, rather than like, oh, I noticed that this is a skill you do have already, but it's not strongest. I can help you fine tune that, compared to, oh, those other skills that I'm not good at, but I know someone else who can help you with. I think that's what coaching does. Like, help aligns with like what you need most and guide you in the right spot to succeed after learning how to do those things that you are trying to work on, that you couldn't get out of just normal skill development or self-help kind of thing. So I think that's really cool. And like with the coaching stuff that you've been doing, what has been like, I don't want to say success stories, but what has been the most rewarding, or things you have heard your clients have told you that have happened to them since, like, uh no, taking upon coaching from you? Like, what was their biggest wins, I guess?
Yeah, so it's funny. I observe this trend with my clients. They often tell me things that are very internal, like a mindset shift or like something that they're experiencing. So some of the rewarding things I will hear is that, oh, I feel that something like deeply profound is happening within myself. I think that I'm like more open to changes now. I feel more at ease. I'm more confident. Like I can manage stress better. So those things come up quite often. That really feels like a great validation of the work that we do together. Then often they will share like the biggest wins in their career to me as like a by the way. which is very interesting. They will say, "Oh, by the way, I got this like amazing grant to fund the work that I really have wanted to do all along. I just thought that you should know." And or like, "By the way, I just got this job," or "By the way, I just got this opportunity and I was able to negotiate a higher fee." And it would like blow me away. That will always then come out in like a "by the way" in an email or like at the end of the call. Because I think what I observe is that our brain still likes to go towards like talking about the problem and forget about like all the wins. But to answer your questions, like the biggest wins have been both internal and external. External as in things that are easy, quantifiable, higher pay, finding a new job, career transition. The internal stuff is like, I think, what my clients and myself have come to really value: their sense of resilience, sense of confidence, and sense of ease in managing their career.
That's awesome. And we talked a lot about, your creative coaching, your philosophy behind it, and what you kind of hope to do for the community and such. So for those that are listening that are Asian, that are creative, that have done all the stuff that they have done and haven't worked out what works for them, or look for a change so that they could be the best self of the best self, and you're considered coaching, definitely check out Betty and her content, and just who knows, maybe you would want a coaching session with her. So it's really up to you. If you're ready for it, you should definitely check it out. And I just want to touch on a little other things, because um, you're more than just your coaching business now. You're also heavily involved in like filmmaking or like video production, all that stuff. And now you just released a podcast as well. So very multifaceted, kind of creative. So I want to touch on like, oh, your kind of filmmaking side now, like, because recently, or at least I've noticed you've been putting more, not putting more effort, but talking more about your other kind of side, which is your filmmaking. Can you talk about what have you been doing on that front compared to like just your online or just your creative coaching?
Yeah, thanks for also bringing that piece into the conversation. So, for filmmaking, really, in the past, at least 2 years, I've been very focused and recently delivered a project called Uprooted, the Plantemic. It's a short animated series that looks at the life of pandemic from houseplant's perspective. And for me, like, this project means a lot because it started in like at a time that I think, like many filmmakers, I was in a place of loss because of the pandemic. We couldn't go out to shoot, or just couldn't go out at all. There was a period in Canada that was like lockdown, and so at the time, I have to say I also was experiencing a lot of like mental health, anxiety, that kind of problems, and it was a really healing project for me to think outside the box. And for those of you who get a chance to check it out later, I mean, it's a very fun project to look at life from trans perspective. So for me, this project has been a love letter to the world, also love letter to myself. Always reminding me that like my creative energy, if I follow it, it can grow and flourish into something bigger. And I hope that the people who watch it also get that sense of like um not necessarily happiness, but just like a comfort at a time that I recognize very difficult for everybody. um and with that, I'm also running I'm a partner of a video business called Common Factor Media. The four partners at the business, we do corporate videos, commercials, and also do films together. So Pandemic is a project, Uprooted Pandemic is a project that we've worked on together. With the business side of the video business, I actually take a pretty like relaxed way of running the business, believe it or not, because all the partners that involved in that business are multifaceted creatives. We all come from different professional, not background, but like professional orientation. So I have fundraising and coaching. One of us that's teaching in a university. One of us is a curator. So, you know, we are able to like kind of co-create this vision of like growing this thing that we all feel passionate about, but not in a way that is like all go 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 at this all the time, which is really fulfilling for me, because we all want to um, create together, and filmmaking is a collaborative endeavor. At the same time, with all the things I'm doing, I also like want to be strategic and mindful of my capacity, and this has kind of worked out to be the model.
Wow, that's very cool. And I look forward to seeing more of your work in terms of the film production side, because I think we need more Asian creatives in that field, specifically in mainstream kind of like no movies, film media of all sort. Because no, now I think a lot of people say we're in an Asian Renaissance, where a lot of Asian representation, and a lot of Asians are making their way to movies, music, media, and all sort, and that's a great thing. How about from your perspective, from being in the industry, what are your thoughts on it? Like, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I would say that like the my whole career being involved in film festival uh, has been a great time of witnessing that kind of like you call it renaissance just now, or like a new wave of like being able to value and put forward the like or really highlight creatives or filmmakers, or content creators that are Asian in the diaspora context. Specifically, I think my purview has been looking at the Asian American and Asian Canadian context. And I would say, 10 years ago when I started, it's definitely not like now. And the direction is right. Like we are providing or like seeing opportunities more open up for Asian creative and BIPOC creatives in general. Uh, One thing I would say is like let's not forget the generations that have to come before this moment, and that the work has to be passed on and continue with momentum. Because the one thing that I think a lot of times that I do slightly worry about is like we've arrived at this place and people think that that's like we've arrived, Asian representation done. There's still miles and miles away for that to for that movement to continue. And I think we can all take part and contribute a piece of it. Yeah.
That's great, and yeah, I agree with you. Like, there's still lots to be done, and you are doing your part, and I am very optimistic and hopeful of like what's to come for Asian representation and what Asian creators will do in the future, because I think we have the capacity, we have the skills, we just need to keep pushing for the opportunity, and the opportunity is there. There's no more kind of heavy gatekeeping that no generations and generations of Asian Canadians, Asian Americans had encountered. I think there could be still some gatekeeping, but with the power of the internet and just the ability to mobilize on social media, we can get a lot of things done to create content that we want, that represent us, that shows who we are beyond stereotypes, and overall just showing the real authentic Asian diaspora experience that I think very much needed in like the whole zeitgeist of like media, because I think that will allow for at least some impact on how Asian diaspora are looked upon by everyone else. And we need to create more content. I think that's the key. Just keep creating, and we're all doing that. And it's been so nice talking to you, hearing your story, hearing your experience, and your knowledge on just you know being a creative, being you know in the filmmaking industry, and now you're doing more creative coaching, helping the future Asian creative in terms of their path, in terms of helping them figure out what they want to do. And I thank you so much for doing this. And before we go, thank you so much for spending the time to chat about your story, your experience, and your thoughts on all things creative and just living your best creative life. And for those that want to know more about you and learn more about creative coaching and embarking on a creative career the way they want, where can they find you?
So I people everybody can find me on my Instagram, which is at Betty X Coach, and you can also find me on my LinkedIn. I believe just like LinkedIn Betty Xie. And then you can also find me on my website, which is sharebetty.com. And I'm always happy for a chat, whether it's coaching related or not. I'm just happy to connect. I mean, that's how we connected initially, Kyle. So at the end, I also want to express my gratitude for Kyle, you having this podcast first of all, and inviting myself and other awesome Asian to come on and share their stories.
Again, thank you so much for doing this, and all the best to you and all the things that you have going on now and in the future. And on this note, thank you for listening to another episode of What Kind of Asian Are You podcast. And I am your host, Kyle. Tune in next week for another episode featuring conversations about being Asian. Till next time, bye bye. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like, comment, and share the podcast on your social media and rate us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can find us by just searching What Kind of Asian Are You podcast on Google and at What Kind of Asian Pod on Instagram. For the YouTube listeners, make sure to subscribe, like, comment, and ring the notification bell. Last but not least, buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/whatkindofasian. Thank you again, and make sure to tune in next time for another awesome episode.